In this lesson, we'll model planting in an abstract style as seen on scaled architectural models. So the area that we'll be working on in this lesson will be this roof slab that we have on top of our building. Now, I was busy thinking of what type of garden I could put on or how I could basically fill up this space. So a garden already is a very good way to go forward to have a spill out space for the expo. And then I started thinking about how I'm going to represent this garden. And I kept reminding myself that we're building a 3D model that is supposed to remind us of a scaled architectural model, not necessarily a typical 3D render where we can go and add a couple of high poly trees or a couple of image trees that are on flat 2D planes or anything in that typical workflow. We want to create something that is much more abstract. Then I thought back to my architectural school days, and I remember how we just took simple dowel wooden sticks and we basically cut them up and pasted them onto the card surface to represent trees. And that's pretty much what we're going to be doing in our 3D model. So then I started thinking about what type of design of garden would be appropriate. And since the theme of our expo is man versus nature, I think there's no better way of representing man's control over nature or belief thereof than the idea of a Victorian castle type garden, typical of what you would see in a French or English chateau where you have this perfect geometry that's all laid out and all manicured. So that's going to be the style that we want to create. So then I started thinking about how I'm going to go and model it, and normally I would recreate it with neat splines and I would go and boolean those splines and create a whole detailed geometry for myself and then go and create the garden on top of that. But because I want to show you a speed modeling workflow, I'm going to rather do it in a much faster, simpler method. I'm going to start first of all by making a copy of my top roof slab. So Control V on your keyboard again and just isolate out that copied layer. Then we can take this and let's create a new layer for ourselves. It's going to be called 06 Gardens, and we can add this object to that new layer. Then we can start working on this in a way where we start to create our geometry that we're going to add our planting to. So the first thing I'd like to do is cut out a bigger hole for myself. So I'm going to go and reveal my source object layer again, and I'm going to make a copy of that layer, and then I'm going to just isolate out my original layer. Just make sure that the layer that you do have is actually the garden layer and not the one of the floors. And this copied sphere I'm now going to increase the size of, perhaps so big. And I'm going to do the same thing that we did before where we cut out this hole. The only thing I want to do now is I want to make sure that I am not getting any of this sloped area within my surface that I'm going to be revealing and leaving over on the side here. So let's go again and convert this down to editable poly. I'm going to add a new Boolean. So go across to your geometry tab, go down to compound objects, then Boolean. I'm going to choose to use refine again and pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to do this quite quickly so that we can basically see the whole process as it happens in real time. So now I'm going to select the objects that I need to delete. So I'm going to select the border, control click the object for the polygon, and then I'm just going to grow that slightly until I have that selection all in place. I'm just going to check that all of the edges are correct. For example, there are a few tiny ones here that I need to still remove. And I'm just going to quickly scan, and then once I'm ready I can hit delete. Then I'm going to start removing more of the polys. For example, I would like to make the entire border a little bit smaller, so I'm going to remove one edge of poly. So I've just selected the border, hit delete on the keyboard, and all of that is gone. Next, I'm going to cut a couple of avenues down the middle and also down the axis in this direction as well. So again, hit delete, and you can see how very quickly you start to get a geometry out of what's remaining. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Over on this side, I've got wide avenues. Here I've got slightly narrower ones, and basically that's going to be the source object for the gardens. So now we can go and take the border tool again. We can select all of this, and we already have a neat outline for our gardens. Now what we can do is we can either plant this entire surface or we can plant something within it. So I'm going to choose the border tool. Let's go and create a spline out of it. and we can create a linear spline for that. So this now can become a little curb of some sort. You can go and sweep it, for example. We can create a sweep modifier there, create a little bar for it so that we have a bit of a height, and we can go and increase or at least raise up the floor area here by 100 millimeters, and let's just increase the size of this as well. We can undo smoothing, undo banking, and let's just increase the size to be 0.1 by 0.1, and let's just change that alignment of the pivot to be at the corner. So basically now you've very quickly created a raised garden surface. You've created a little edge for yourself, so you're going to have a nice bit of detail there. Perhaps we can just drop this down ever so slightly again so that we can actually see that curb a little bit better. And you can now choose where you want to add your planting. What I'm going to do is just plant the edges of this, since I would like the space to not be completely planted, otherwise we'll completely lose our usable space on the roof. So instead I'm just going to create a hedge around the outside. So the way I'm going to do that is by making a copy of this curb, and I'm going to increase the size of it and then basically use that as the source object for my hedge, or at least the planting or the garden that I'm going to be creating on it. So I'm going to create a 0.8 meter surface object that I'm going to be planting now. So I can now go and isolate this out, and you can see you already have quite a neat geometry that you can start to use now. So next I'm going to add a few areas where I'm going to cut out entrances. So in my top view, I'm just going to punch out a few holes here. So let's go and just cut a few avenues in this direction so that basically we don't have any trees in those places. And perhaps we can go and cut a few things out here too. And once I've done it to look more or less symmetrical, I can then go and reveal that object again, and I'm going to do that in a moment. I'm going to hit delete. And here you can also create another editable spline on top of this source so that you do have your complete edge still intact, but I'm just going to go ahead and delete it as I have it and then see the results of what I've created. So I think that should probably be fine for the example that I'm showing you. Once you add your sweep back to it, you can see that you have that object. What you can also do, if you don't want to texture this as a hedge, if you do want to use it as a source object and create those vertical cylinders as I mentioned earlier, we can also, instead of creating an editable spline, let's add another editable spline modifier and select all of the splines. Then we can scroll down and we can create an outline to them. So let's create a 0.8 meter outline towards the inside, and now you can see that we've just created a nice hedge outline for ourselves that we can go and plant. If you add an editable poly modifier on top of that, you can see that you now have your hedges. Now this object we're going to again isolate out, and we're going to create one of the plant objects, which is just going to be a simple cylinder in our case. So let's go now to our object, create a standard primitive, and we're going to be creating a cylinder. So I'm going to just adjust all of the figures here. I'm going to make it 0.1 meters in radius, perhaps even smaller. And the height is going to be only 1 meter. The height segments I don't need to have any, and the sides I can drop it down to 6. So I can just be working with something that's quite low poly. I definitely don't need to have anything too complicated there. So make sure that everything as well is on your garden layer once you start creating more complicated objects, just so that you keep everything neatly organized. So next we're going to be using the scatter tool again. So go down to compound objects, click on scatter. Distribution object is going to be the object that we've just created, and just as we did before in the display area, we're going to hide the distribution object, and here we're not going to be choosing vertices as we did before, but even, and now you can choose the number of duplicates. So I'm immediately going to punch in 500 so you can see the result of that. And I think that eventually we will need many, many more, and perhaps we can even make it slightly smaller in the base scale, and then we can increase the size of it in a transform. So we can add a scaling of, let's say, 30%, and we can lock that aspect ratio so that it basically has an X, Y, and Z growing at the same time. And here let's go and change the rotation. So let's give it a 15-degree angle in the X and the Y. And also let's add a rotation so that is correct, and we have a scaling, and that is done. So if you start creating too many objects for yourself and you do want to make it slightly easier for your graphics card to display things in your viewport, for example, if I want to have 1500 duplicates, it starts becoming a little bit tedious for your scene to update in the viewport. So here you do have the option to display less. So I can, for example, display 10, and I can choose proxy so that it is much easier to render and work with as an object. So that pretty much brings me to the end of this lesson. All I wanted to show you is how you can use existing objects. So here we used our existing floor slab, and we basically cut out of it, and we made copies and modified those copies so that we can continue to work on our new objects using the referenced old objects. And this is one of the best ways that you can have a speed modeling workflow where you're never really creating anything new, but you're rather just extracting out edges or splines or any type of new object out of your previously created objects that you've already worked on. That's obviously going to save you a lot of time so that you don't have to recreate all of this from scratch. So I hope you enjoyed that. We're now going to jump into the textures area of our course. So we're going to be doing quite a basic palette of textures as well that's going to resemble a scale model. So all of that's going to be handled in the next lesson. So hang around and give that a watch.